You were taught that raising your vibration is about adding something: more meditation, more positivity, more rituals, more control over your thoughts. But what if the truth is far less comfortable and far more confronting? What if everything you've been doing to evolve is actually keeping you exactly where you are? Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment below what resonated most so far. Your engagement helps build a space where real transformation, not illusion, can grow. Carl Jung uncovered something that most modern spirituality avoids. The ego is incredibly intelligent. It doesn't just resist change, it disguises itself as growth. And one of its most sophisticated disguises is the need to be understood. At first glance, this need feels innocent, even reasonable. Of course you want people to understand you. Of course you want to explain your choices, your feelings, your perspective. But Jung saw something deeper beneath this impulse, something most people never question. The constant need to be understood is not about clarity. It is about control. It is the unconscious belief that your inner state depends on how others perceive you, that your peace depends on their agreement, that your identity becomes more real when it is mirrored back to you through someone else's validation. And so you explain. You explain why you made that decision. You explain why you reacted the way you did. You explain your boundaries, your intentions, your past, your reasoning. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for better words, sharper logic, a clearer tone. You imagine how you could have said it differently, how you could have finally made them understand. But they didn't. And that creates a subtle form of suffering that most people normalize, the feeling of being unseen, misinterpreted, misjudged. So you try again, from another angle, with more patience, more effort, more emotional labor. But here is the truth Jung forces you to confront. The need to be understood is not a bridge to connection. It is a chain that binds you to external validation. As long as your sense of self depends on someone else getting it, you are not free. You are negotiating your identity in real time. You are outsourcing your inner authority to people who, by definition, cannot fully access your internal world. And the more you try to make them understand, the more you abandon yourself in the process. Because real self-possession does not require explanation. It does not demand agreement. It does not seek permission. It stands, quietly, firmly, without the urgency to convince. Jung observed that individuals who begin to individuate, to truly become themselves, undergo a painful shift. They realize that most people will never fully understand them, not because they are unintelligent, not because they don't care, but because every human being perceives reality through their own conditioning, wounds, and limitations. You are asking someone to see through your lens while they are still trapped in theirs. And no amount of explanation can bridge that completely. This is where most people get stuck. Because letting go of being understood feels like losing connection. It feels like isolation. It feels like disappearing. But in reality, the opposite is happening. You are reclaiming your energy. Every moment you stop over-explaining, you take back the energy that was leaking outward. Every time you resist the urge to justify yourself, you reinforce an internal foundation that does not collapse under misunderstanding. And something subtle begins to change. You become less reactive, less defensive, less dependent. Not because you don't care, but because your sense of self is no longer fragile. You begin to understand yourself without needing translation. And that is where real elevation begins. Because high consciousness is not about being seen by everyone. It is about seeing yourself clearly, even when no one else does. There is a level of inner stability that cannot coexist with the need for constant external confirmation. One must die for the other to live, and that death is uncomfortable. It is the death of the version of you that needed to be validated to feel real. The version that performed clarity for acceptance. The version that believed peace comes from being understood. Jung did not romanticize this process. He knew it would feel like loss. But what you lose is illusion, and what you gain is sovereignty. When you finally release the attachment to being understood, you stop explaining your worth. You stop defending your truth. You stop shrinking your complexity into something digestible for others. You simply become. And paradoxically, this is when your presence becomes more powerful than any explanation you could ever give. Because people don't feel your words as much as they feel your certainty. They don't connect to your explanations as much as they connect to your energy. And energy that is no longer begging to be validated becomes undeniable. What this reveals is something deeper than most people are willing to admit. Your dependence on being understood is not about communication. It is about stability. It is about needing someone outside of you to confirm that what you feel, what you perceive, what you know, is real. Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment below what resonated most so far. Your engagement helps build a space where real transformation, not illusion, can grow. And the moment your inner reality depends on external confirmation, you have already lost your center. You are no longer grounded in your own consciousness. You are negotiating it. You are adjusting it. You are filtering it through the minds of others, hoping it comes back approved. Carl Jung saw this pattern with striking clarity. He realized that people who require others to understand them in order to feel valid are still psychologically dependent. They have not yet developed what he called internal authority, the ability to stand inside their own experience without needing it to be mirrored back by the world. This dependency is subtle, but it is powerful, because it keeps you tied to consensus reality. When others don't see what you see, you begin to doubt your vision. When others don't feel what you feel, you question your emotions. When others challenge your choices, you reconsider your direction. Not because you are wrong, but because you do not yet trust yourself deeply enough to remain steady in the face of disagreement. So you search for people who will understand, people who will validate, people who will confirm that your internal world is legitimate. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The more you rely on that validation, the weaker your connection to your own knowing becomes. Because trust is not built through agreement. It is built through endurance, through standing in your truth when it is not reflected back to you, through remaining grounded when you are misunderstood, through continuing forward even when no one else sees what you see. Jung observed that individuals who had genuinely elevated their consciousness no longer needed to be understood as a prerequisite for feeling real. They could share, but they did not depend on being received. They could express, but they did not collapse when they were misinterpreted. They knew what they knew. They felt what they felt. And that knowing remained intact regardless of whether anyone else could follow them into it. This is the shift most people resist. Because releasing the need to be understood feels like stepping into isolation. It feels like losing connection. But in reality, you are not losing connection. You are losing dependency. And there is a profound difference between the two. Dependency says, I need you to see me so I can feel real. Sovereignty says, I see myself. And that is enough. You will know you are approaching this level when something very specific begins to happen. Someone misunderstands you, and you remain calm. A conversation ends without resolution, and you do not feel the urge to chase closure. You make a decision that others question, and instead of defending it, you simply continue walking your path. There is no urgency, no inner panic, no compulsion to correct their perception, just a quiet, grounded certainty. That is what internal authority feels like. And that stability, that self-trust that no longer fractures under misunderstanding, is what vibrating higher actually looks like in lived experience. Not aesthetic spirituality, not performative calm, but unshakable presence. If this resonates with you, leave 1 out of 11 in the comments. Within Jung's symbolic framework, this number represents the moment of awakening to internal authority. The point where a person begins to trust their own perception without requiring consensus to validate it. If this is where you are, or where you feel called to go, mark it, because this is not just an idea, it is a threshold. Now, the second thing you must release is even more confronting. The need to be seen as good. Jung called this the persona, the mask you constructed to be accepted, approved of, and ultimately, safe. This mask is not random. It was built intelligently, often in early life, in response to what you learned would earn you love, and what would risk losing it. So you adapted. You became agreeable, helpful, understanding, patient. You learned to soften your edges, suppress your impulses, and present a version of yourself that others could easily accept. And over time, that version became your identity. But here is the problem Jung identified with brutal honesty. You cannot access higher consciousness while maintaining a self that was designed for approval. Because that self is not real. It is strategic. Think about how much energy you spend managing how you are perceived, choosing your words carefully so you don't offend, holding back your truth so you don't create tension, saying yes when your entire body wants to say no. You convince yourself it is kindness. You label it as compassion. You frame it as emotional intelligence. But underneath it, there is something far less noble driving the behavior. Fear. The fear of being rejected. The fear of being disliked. The fear of being seen as difficult, selfish, or wrong. So you perform goodness, not because it flows naturally, but because it protects you. And that performance comes at a cost. Because every time you suppress what is real in order to maintain what is acceptable, you create internal fragmentation, a split between who you are and who you show. Jung understood that this split is one of the primary sources of psychological suffering. Because the parts of you that are rejected do not disappear, they go underground. Your anger becomes hidden, your boundaries become weak, your truth becomes diluted, and over time you lose contact with your own authenticity. You become predictable, manageable, safe for others, but disconnected from yourself. Jung discovered that this state, this constant performance of goodness, is not high frequency. It is survival, because you are not acting from wholeness. You are acting from fear. True elevation does not come from being perceived as good. It comes from being real. And real is not always comfortable. Real means you can be kind, and also firm, compassionate, and also direct, open, and also boundaried. It means you stop filtering your entire existence through the question, will this make me acceptable? And start living from a different question entirely. Is this true? People who have released the persona are not easier to control. You cannot manipulate them with guilt, because they are no longer trying to prove they are good. You cannot shame them into compliance, because they have already accepted that some people will misunderstand them, judge them, or even reject them, and they are at peace with that. That is what makes them powerful. Not dominance, not force, but freedom. The freedom to exist without constant self-editing. The freedom to respond authentically instead of strategically. The freedom to be whole, even when that wholeness disrupts expectations. And yes, this will make some people uncomfortable, because when you stop performing, you stop being predictable. And people who rely on your predictability will feel that shift immediately. But that discomfort is not a sign you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain harmony, and that is the beginning of real transformation. The moment you begin to believe that your role is to heal everyone, to save everyone, to carry everyone, you step into a subtle trap that feels like purpose, but is actually bondage. Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment below what resonated most so far. Your engagement helps build a space where real transformation, not illusion, can grow. Carl Jung studied what he called the wounded healer archetype, and what he found was deeply uncomfortable. Because on the surface, it looks noble, it looks compassionate, it looks like love. But beneath that surface, there is often something far more complex driving the behavior. A need, not a conscious one, but a psychological dependency on being needed. You help, you support, you listen, you give. But if you are honest, there are moments when your helping is not entirely about the other person. It is about how it makes you feel. Valuable, important, irreplaceable. And without realizing it, you begin to build your identity around that role. The one who is always there, the one who fixes, the one who understands, the one who carries. Jung observed that this pattern rarely comes from true abundance. It comes from unhealed parts of the self-seeking resolution through others. Because if you can fix them, maybe unconsciously, you can fix yourself. If you can save them, maybe you won't have to face what remains unresolved within you. And this is where the distortion begins. Because helping, in its purest form, is free. It is offered without attachment, without identity, without the need for outcome. But compulsive helping is different. It attaches, it interferes, It overextends. It gives even when it is not asked. It stays even when it is not healthy. It sacrifices even when it is not necessary. And the most difficult truth Jung revealed is this: people who are addicted to being needed often surround themselves with those who cannot fully heal, not consciously, but psychologically. Because if those people became whole, the helper would lose their role. Their identity would collapse. And so, without realizing it, they remain in cycles where they are always giving, but never truly free. Releasing this pattern does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean closing your heart. It means becoming honest. Honest about when your help is truly serving, and when it is quietly feeding a part of you that is afraid to exist without being needed. It means learning to step back, to allow others to struggle, to allow others to choose, to allow others to face the consequences that are necessary for their growth. Because not every act of helping is an act of love. Sometimes it is an interruption of someone else's evolution. And sometimes the most powerful form of compassion is restraint. If you recognize this pattern within yourself, leave 528 in the comments. In symbolic terms, this represents the shift from compulsive helping to genuine compassion. The moment when care begins to flow from wholeness, not from need. Now, the fourth thing you must release is even more confronting: the identity of being wounded. This is where most people stop, because healing, as it is commonly taught, encourages you to explore your pain, to understand your trauma, to give language to your suffering. And this is necessary, but it is not the end of the process. Jung discovered that many people become incredibly skilled at understanding their wounds. Without ever releasing their identification with them, they can explain everything: why they are the way they are, what hurt them, how it shaped their patterns. They have insight, awareness, vocabulary, but beneath all of that, they are still living as the wounded version of themselves. Their identity is organized around what happened to them. Their relationships are shaped by it. Their choices are filtered through it. Their sense of what is possible is limited by it. They do not just have wounds, they are the wound. And this is where the trap becomes invisible, because identifying as wounded can feel like truth. It can feel like honesty. It can even feel like depth. But Jung saw that when this identity is not released, it becomes a prison, a subtle form of victim consciousness, not in a blaming or dismissive way, but in a structural way, where your present reality is continuously interpreted through your past pain, where your reactions are shaped by what hurt you before, where your expectations are limited by what you believe you deserved then, and without realizing it, you continue to recreate the same emotional environments, the same dynamics, the same patterns, because your identity is still anchored in them. Releasing the identity of being wounded does not mean denying your past. It does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means something far more difficult. It means no longer using your past as the foundation of who you are. It means allowing the version of you that was defined by pain to end. And that feels like death, because for a long time, that identity gave you meaning. It gave you explanation. It gave you a way to understand yourself and your experiences. But it also kept you confined. Jung believed that true healing is not just about remembering what hurt you. It is about becoming someone who is no longer defined by it. Someone who has integrated the experience and moved beyond it, where your past becomes part of your story, but not the center of your identity. And when that shift happens, something profound begins to change. Your choices are no longer reactions. Your relationships are no longer repetitions. Your life is no longer a continuation of what was done to you. It becomes something new, something chosen, something created from awareness, not from pain. And that is where real freedom begins. There comes a point in your evolution where understanding your pain is no longer enough, where insight, no matter how deep, begins to feel repetitive, because something in you realizes that you are still living inside the same identity you have spent years trying to heal. Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment below what resonated most so far. Your engagement helps build a space where real transformation, not illusion, can grow. Carl Jung saw this clearly. Many people do the work. They process, they analyze, they reflect, but They never leave the identity of the wound. They become experts in their pain. They can explain it with precision, trace it back to its origin, understand every pattern it created, but they are still living as the person it defined, and as long as that identity remains central, their frequency does not change. Their life becomes a more conscious version of the same story. Jung discovered that true elevation requires something far more radical than understanding. It requires release, not of the memory, not of the truth, but of the identity built around it. Because there is a difference between having a wound and being the wound. When you are identified with it, everything filters through it. Your relationships become reflections of it. Your reactions become extensions of it. Your limitations become justified by it. And without realizing it, your entire life becomes organized around something that belongs to your past. Releasing this identity is not easy, because it feels like losing yourself, the story you have told, the explanation you have relied on, the meaning you have created around your suffering. All of it begins to dissolve. And for a moment, there is emptiness. But that emptiness is not loss. It is space. Space for something new to emerge. Jung observed that people who truly evolve reach a point where their past is no longer the most important thing about them. They can speak about it, but they are not anchored in it. They remember, but they are not defined by it. Their identity shifts from, "This is what happened to me," to, "This is who I am becoming." And that shift changes everything. Because when your focus moves from past pain to future emergence, your energy follows. You begin to make decisions from possibility, not protection. You begin to build relationships from presence, not pattern. You begin to live from creation, not reaction. That is what higher consciousness feels like. Not perfection, not constant peace, but movement, forward. If you feel this shift calling you, leave 777 in the comments. Symbolically, this represents the moment where identity moves from fragmentation to integration, from wound to wholeness. Now, the fifth and final release is perhaps the most painful of all. The fantasy of who people could become. Jung called this projection, and it is one of the most deceptive patterns the mind creates. Because it feels like love. You see someone, and you don't just see who they are. You see who they could be. Their potential, their hidden depth. The version of them that might emerge if they healed, if they tried, if they chose differently. And without realizing it, you begin to relate to that version. You invest in it. You believe in it. You wait for it. You stay longer than you should, because you are not in relationship with reality. You are in relationship with possibility. Jung made something very clear. When you are attached to someone's potential, you are not seeing them. You are projecting onto them. You are creating a version of them that meets your emotional needs, and then loving that creation as if it were real. Maybe you need them to become safe, so you can finally relax. Maybe you need them to become consistent, so you don't have to walk away. Maybe you need them to change, so you don't have to face the truth. But whatever the reason, it belongs to you. And as long as you are invested in who they could become, you are avoiding who they are. And who they are is the only thing that is real. This is where the hardest part begins. Because releasing this fantasy requires grief. Real grief. You have to let go of the version of them you believed in. The future you imagined. The possibility you held on to. You have to allow that version to die. Not because it was wrong to hope, but because it is not what exists. And only when that illusion dissolves can you finally see clearly. See the person in front of you as they are. And from that clarity, make real decisions. Not based on hope. Not based on potential. But based on truth. Jung understood that this is where real power returns. Because when you stop projecting, you stop waiting. When you stop waiting, you start choosing. And when you start choosing, your life begins to move again. These 5 releases are not comfortable. They are not easy. They are not something you add to your life. They are what you remove. The need to be understood. The need to be seen as good. The need to save everyone. The identity of being wounded. The fantasy of who others could become. Each one is a layer. And as each layer falls away, something that was always there begins to emerge. Not a new version of you, but the real one. Unfiltered. Unperformed. Unbound. And that is what it actually means to rise. Everything you've been carrying, the need to be understood, the performance of goodness, the compulsion to save everyone, the identity of being wounded, and the illusion of who others could become, are not just habits. They are entire psychological architectures, systems you built, often unconsciously, to survive, to belong, to feel safe in a world that at some point taught you it was not. Before we go deeper, subscribe and comment below what resonated most so far. Your engagement helps build a space where real transformation, not illusion, can grow. And this is why what you are being called into now feels so intense. Because this is not self-improvement. This is not about becoming more polished, more likable, more evolved, in the way the world often defines it. This is about dismantling, about allowing parts of your identity that once protected you to finally come to an end. And that is something the human mind resists at the deepest level. Because those patterns, those identities, those roles, they are familiar. And what is familiar feels safe, even when it is limiting, even when it is quietly suffocating your growth. So instead of releasing, most people compensate. They meditate more. They consume more content. They adopt new language, new concepts, new frameworks. But underneath it all, the structure remains the same. They still need to be understood. They still perform goodness to be accepted. They still rescue others to feel valuable. They still define themselves by what hurt them. They still hold on to who people could become instead of seeing who they are. And so their lives do not truly change. They feel temporary relief, temporary clarity, temporary elevation, but it never stabilizes. Because they are trying to build a higher state on top of a foundation that was never meant to support it. Carl Jung understood this with rare precision. He knew that real transformation is not additive, it is subtractive. You do not become whole by adding more layers. You become whole by removing what is false. But here is the part no one tells you clearly enough. Every removal feels like loss. Every release feels like death. Not symbolic death, real psychological death. The death of the version of you that needed to be understood to feel real. The death of the version of you that needed to be good to be loved. The death of the version of you that needed to be needed to feel valuable. The death of the version of you that organized life around pain. The death of the version of you that lived in hope instead of truth. And when those parts begin to dissolve, there is a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes extended, where you feel disoriented, because you are no longer who you were, but you are not yet fully stabilized in who you are becoming. This is the space most people avoid. They rush to fill it. They rush to redefine themselves. They reach for something new to hold on to so they don't have to sit in the uncertainty. But Jung would say this space is sacred, because it is the only place where something real can emerge, not something constructed, not something performed, but something true. And to stay in that space requires courage, the kind of courage that does not look dramatic from the outside, but feels enormous from within. The courage to not go back to what was familiar. The courage to not rebuild the same identity in a slightly different form. The courage to let the silence, the uncertainty, the openness exist long enough for something deeper to take shape. Jung left us with a statement that holds the full weight of this process. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because complete self-acceptance is not selective. It does not mean accepting only the parts of you that are easy to love. It means facing everything. Your anger, your jealousy, your limits, your needs, your contradictions, your capacity to walk away, your capacity to disappoint others, your inability to be everything for everyone, and allowing all of it to exist, without immediately trying to fix it, hide it, or justify it. That is where real stability begins, not in perfection, but in honesty. And from that honesty, something shifts. You stop negotiating your identity. You stop performing for acceptance. You stop explaining your existence. You begin to stand in something far more grounded. Choice. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This is not an affirmation to repeat. It is a line you cross. A moment where you realize that your past may have shaped you, but it does not have to define the direction of your life anymore. Your wounds were real. The harm was real. The adaptations you built were intelligent, necessary, but they were responses, not your essence. And you are not required to carry those responses any longer than they truly serve you. There is a version of you that exists beyond all of it, not a perfect version, not an idealized version, but a real one that does not need to be understood to feel valid, one that does not need to be good to feel worthy, one that does not need to save others to feel important, one that is not defined by pain, one that sees reality clearly without projection. That version is not something you find in the future. It is something that emerges when you stop holding on to what is not you. Jung also said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that privilege comes with a cost, the cost of letting go, of releasing identities that once felt like you, of stepping away from dynamics that once defined your relationships, of accepting that some people will not come with you into who you are becoming. And that last part is one of the hardest truths to face. Because as you change, your tolerance changes, your standards change, your clarity sharpens, and you begin to see things you once ignored. You begin to feel what no longer aligns. And with that awareness comes decision. Not forced, not rushed, but inevitable. Because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. And from that clarity, your life begins to reorganize itself. Not through force, but through alignment. You choose differently. You respond differently. You relate differently. And, slowly, without needing to announce it, everything begins to shift. This is what real elevation looks like. Not dramatic, not performative, but undeniable. A quiet, steady movement toward truth. And now, this is where it becomes personal. Because none of this matters unless you are willing to apply it. So take a moment and be honest with yourself. Of the 5 things we explored, which one did you recognize immediately? Which one created that subtle discomfort in your chest? That moment where something in you said, "This is me"? Was it the need to be understood? The need to be seen as good? The compulsion to help everyone? The identity of being wounded? Or the attachment to who people could become? And more importantly, which one are you ready to release? Not perfectly, not all at once, but intentionally. Because the moment you truly see it, you are already standing at the edge of change, and what happens next is a choice.